So continuing with our theme of discussion of soldiers being sent out to repress protests for civil rights against racism and what you should really do in that situation, I wanted to go back to 1968 to talk about a rebellion of active duty soldiers in the 1st Armored Division. Now, these soldiers were to be sent to Chicago to do so-called riot control duty at the Democratic National Convention, where there was set to be massive protests against the Vietnam War. Tens of thousands of people were expected to be out. Now, this rebellion consisted of about 100 African-American GIs. It was called a mutiny in the mainstream press. And keep in mind here, when we go into this story, that most of these service members had just gotten back from Vietnam. These weren't people who got drafted and didn't go anywhere, or, they're going to refuse to go to Vietnam or whatever. This was a battalion of soldiers that had gotten back. Many of them who participated in the rebellion had Bronze Stars or other medals for valor. Many of them had Purple Hearts. And many of them were people who had enlisted in the army. They weren't even draftees, so people who were true believers. So what happened with these soldiers out of Fort Hood, Texas, in August of 1968, when they got their activation orders to go suppress the protest against racism against the Vietnam War in Chicago? They had a mass meeting and decided that they would not go. They were going to refuse to board the plane on Fort Hood, Texas, to be sent to Chicago to take part in so-called riot control. So to really tell the story, I don't want to tell it myself. I want to go back to active duty soldiers at the time who told this story. So I'm going to read an article that was published in the newspaper called The Bond, which was a newspaper that was produced and written and distributed by active duty soldiers. So I'm going to read the article printed in September of 1968. And keep in mind, this was distributed to thousands of soldiers, not just on Army bases and Marine bases and Air Force and Navy bases throughout the United States, but to soldiers in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam. These many people had joined the ASU who worked in mail distribution, helicopter supply, and were distributing this newspaper to thousands on the front lines of the war in Vietnam. If you want to learn more about this, go back to our episode titled Andy Stapp and the American Servicemen's Union, where we go over this whole history. So the article goes, Black GIs at Fort Hood refuse riot control. Mass resistance by Black GIs here has shaken the Army. On the night of August 23rd, nearly 100 Black GIs massed in the main intersection on post in protest of being used as part of so-called riot control. Actually, repression of their own people. Fort Hood troops were being ordered to Chicago. They refused to leave the intersection in spite of the pleas of their commanding general. At dawn, 43 were arrested. The men began gathering at 9 p.m. on Friday, August 23rd, at 65th and Central to protest the use of federal troops in Chicago and to protest against racism. When news of the mass protests reached the startled ears of General Bowles of the 1st Armored Division, he came out personally at about midnight to plead, not to order, but to plead with the men to disperse. They refused. Then, fearing the massive support that these protesters had from the rank and file throughout the post, the nervous general said that they could stay there all night without repercussions. He even raised his right hand and swore to this concession with 8 other brass hats, 8 colonels, as witnesses. But he refused to sign a paper to that effect, as suggested by some of the men. The men stayed. At 5:45 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Kulo, the post provost marshal, announced, quote, "I want you all to go back to the barracks," end quote. They did not leave. At 5:58 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Kulo threatened, quote, "I'm asking you to leave now, otherwise MPs will take you in," end quote. The bugle sounded. 60 MPs marched up and took 43 men away for, quote, "failure to report," Article 86. In the stockade, while the men were waiting to contact lawyers, they were asked if they wanted chow. Since they wanted to hold all moves until they had arranged to see lawyers, they didn't go. MPs were then marched in and the captain told the black soldiers to get up and go to the mess hall. Nobody moved. The demand was for lawyers first. The MPs were then unleashing, punching, hitting the seated men with their nightsticks. Several men were injured and refused medical help. Then the Army tried the soft cell, providing cigarettes, food, and beds. But the demand was still no move until legal aid was allowed. The GI who had received a decoration for heroism in Vietnam was suffering from a kidney problem caused by the wounds in the beating. He was denied medical care. Another member of the group was also denied medical attention at this time. 8 of the men have been charged with violation of Article 90, disobeying a legal order, which calls for a general court-martial. 34 are facing a special court-martial. One was acquitted. Legal help was arranged by the American Servicemen's Union. Lawyers for the General Courts-Martial are being provided by the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee and the Workers' Defense League. The 34 special courts-martial defendants are being represented by attorneys from the NAACP Legal Fund. And the following is a statement from one of the black GIs at Fort Hood. He writes, "Ironically, 43 men are to stand trial here at Fort Hood, Texas, for refusing riot duty in Chicago, and 43 men will probably be tried and convicted. Ironical, because it is Fort Hood that should be on trial, not 14 disgruntled black soldiers. First, I would like to say that the policy of equal rights and opportunity, as outlined by the Army regulations, has broken down here at Fort Hood, as usual, due to human elements. These men, as well as I, are very much aware of the racial inequality that has existed here, and this should be considered part of what they are protesting. Take, for example, quote, riot control training, a big joke because it is itself an addition to the problem. For weeks in class, I listened to white first and second lieutenants assail the Negro rioters in the 100 cities following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., assailing them as filthy-mouthed punks and hoodlums who, under the leadership of a self-styled messiah such as Rap Brown and Leroy Jones, had brought this country close to anarchy. No one seemed to be aware of any real facts or vaguely familiar with the findings by the, quote, President's Commission on Racial Disorder. No one made any attempt to explore the possible causal relation between rioting and the understandable hatred that is mounted as a result of the social and economic deprivation. I, as well as others, was tired of hearing nasty words to describe my brothers, but no nasty words used to describe their situation. I agree my people are raising plenty of hell about being treated so badly, but don't expect me to go to Chicago with a bunch of white guys who, after some of our classes, are under the impression that, quote, we must stop the barbarians. The Houston Chronicle, Tuesday, September 3rd, made reference to our usage of the clenched fist as a symbol of sympathy for these soldiers who are to be tried. Don't get me wrong. We are with them all the way, but our fists have been up for months. As for going to Chicago, simply out of the question. By a black soldier in Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 41st Infantry, and the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Hood. Many of who became known as the Fort Hood 43 were found guilty and punished, but received pretty light sentences of simply 3 to 6 months in the brig. To them, an easy price to pay in exchange for not having to obey orders that conflicted with their conscience.
Eyes left.